9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Hello again. This is Joe Murray, February the 20th, and I'm interviewing Sheila Baslaw. Now, I should interject here that this is not the Sheila that I wanted to interview. I wanted to interview Sheila Baslaw, and because I'm interested in knowing who the Baslaws were and how they came to be in Ottawa. So, it's your nickel. You're on.
Okay. Well, I wish I knew more about my family, both on the maternal and paternal side. But let's start with the maternal side. My mother came from a family of 7, 2 boys and 5 girls. Oh, the names of the... Okay. The name, my mother's maiden name was Radnofsky, and her sisters were Yetta, Dora, Fanny, Lily, let me see, who else? The 2 boys were Dave and Kisel.
From where?
They were from Smila, from the Ukraine. They came here, oh, good. My mother's sister that I forgot is Dora. And their father, their parents, had a lumber yard. They were well-to-do, but both parents died early. The other daughter that I forgot to mention is Sophie, who became Sophie Spivak. The parents died early. The great-grandparents, my great-grandfather, was a very rich man, and he arranged to have silver spoons given to every grandchild for generations, and I still have one of those spoons. They've been handed down. But during the pogroms and the death of the parents, gradually the family came here to Canada. And they came here because the first one that left was Sophie, and she came to Canada. Her husband was Shia Spivak, and he was in the business of furs in Buckingham. And so he was a well-to-do man, and he had no family of his own, he had 2 maiden sisters, but somehow he really attached himself to his wife's family, and he gradually brought them all over. They came to Ottawa, and some went on. My mother went on to go to New York because she was a seamstress, and she did buttonholes for couturiers, and she was the most educated of the family. She was able to read and write in Russian and in Hebrew, and she spoke Yiddish, of course. And she stayed in New York for some time, and she came to visit her sister and met my father. My father was married. My father's uncle was married to my mother's sister. A lot of these Jewish connections, people met through family, I think, in those days. That was a close area of contact. So my mother met my father, and he immediately made up his mind that he wanted to marry her. She wasn't so sure. But he convinced her, and they got married. My father was working as an upholsterer at that time for other people, and decided he could make it on his own. Now, my father also came from a family of 7, and also 5 daughters and 2 sons. And he came from the city of Porila, and then when his father couldn't get work in Porila because it was a very small village, they moved to Uman. And my father's father had a mill, but he lost the mill in Porila when the pogrom started and the Cossacks came, and that's when he started to go to work in Uman. Eventually the family joined him there, and he in Uman, though, things were very difficult, and they had very little in the way of Jews weren't allowed to do so many things. They weren't allowed to be in the trades. They weren't allowed to have sugar cane. They weren't allowed to have. They weren't allowed to go to school other than the shtetl schools and so on. So the oldest daughter went to America, got married, and began to bring the whole family over. So my father ended up in Ottawa because he had an uncle here who had come from the shtetl. Lisa. My father came to Ottawa and started his upholstery business after working for other people, and he brought his father over. And his father, and he brought his mother over too. Anyway. Okay, my father's name, the Yiddish name, was Shaya, and my, sorry, I've mixed up here. And my grandfather's name was Shaya, I think. And I think my father's name was definitely Shaika. He brought his parents over here. His mother died soon after she arrived. Life was very hard because it was the Depression. And I remember my mother saying that she hoped nobody would come to the door at dinner time because all they had was a can of sardines, which was 3 cents at the time, and they wouldn't be able to share it, or they would share it, but there wasn't really enough. So times were difficult, and Ishaya, my grandfather, sold cigarettes. He always had cigarettes in his pocket, and he sold them, and that's the way he made a few bucks. Otherwise, he went with my father on his calls in the truck. And in those days, we didn't have a car. We had a truck because that's what you took Chesterfields in. And my father first had a shop over Woolworths on Wellington Street, and we lived nearby. And he used to take the Chesterfields up and down by pulley. And I thought that this was amazing as I would watch him pull these Chesterfields up and down. And I remember we used to play hide and seek in among all the Chesterfields, my brother and my sister and I. We lived on Wellington Street in an apartment until I was about 9 years old. But there were very few Jewish people in the west end of the city at the time. There were about 4 families. And in order to bring the family to meet with other Jewish families, my father bought a house in Sandy Hill. And he also, just about that time, had bought a little church. And it was a Roman Catholic church, and it came with the priest's house. And the priests and the diocese asked if my father would let the priest continue to live in this little house on the church, and my father said, fine. Isn't that amazing? The things that we remember. Oh, wonderful.
The shop was where, Sheila?
The shop was on Clarence and Chapel. Yeah, on the corner.
That's right across from Anglesey Square.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the how are you doing now?
Oh, good. You're doing fine. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I was just reminded, as I was thinking about things, that my mother came over to Canada, actually, with her sister and brother-in-law. This was the Slipikoffs. So she came over with Dora and Sam Slipikoff and their 2 children, Charlie and Robert. And the important things that they carried was the Iber blanket, the Eider blanket, and the samovar. And they carried that blanket on the ship and everywhere. And as soon as they arrived, the Spivaks met them at the ship and said, "Get rid of that thing, it smells." And my mother said that she had carried it all that way, but she realized that they had to get rid of it. Also, they stayed with the Spivaks until they got settled. And these were hard times because it was a depression. My mother immediately went to New York to find work. And the Slipikoffs, he had a horse and wagon and sold vegetables and fruit and so on. So the family, there were parts of the family, my mother's family here in Ottawa. The Spivaks were very well-to-do, and they were the ones that took an interest and helped everybody. My uncle, Shia Spivak, was very good at giving money to all the people in high positions that would allow people to come in. And when he was told that they would allow farm hands in, he bought a farm so he could have people go through the farm. So Shia Spivak was the central point for my mother's maternal family, and he was very like a doting father to all of them. And my father's family, on the other hand, were mostly ended up in Detroit, and because one of the sisters ended up there. But my father decided to stay here. He had an uncle here. And once he met my mother, they decided to make their life here. As I mentioned before, my father didn't. When he was asked what he did, he was an electrician, but he figured that upholstering was a good trade. He figured it was very simple. He had seen very simple Chesterfields in Russia, and he figured anybody could do it. As he later said, he had no idea there was French provincial and Italian and all these other things that he had to learn how to do. But he did, and he became very competent at it. As I mentioned before, my father bought this church. It was a little Roman Catholic church, and they had asked that he not take down the altar when they sold it to him. And so he never took down the altar, but he put all his materials on the altar. So I don't know which was worse, leaving the altar up or taking it down. My father stayed in that business, and he delivered Chesterfields, and he made them. He had people working for him of various nationalities, Italian, Polish, and they all spoke different languages. As a matter of fact, one of these young boys was presented to him by one of the priests. When the Italians came over after the war, the priest came and asked my father if he would find employment for this young Italian man. My father did, and eventually this is the man who bought my father's business from him. But getting back to, my father worked very hard. He worked very long hours. He was up at 6 and home at 11. Lunch was, he had lunch at home, and that was the big meal. And he usually had a siesta after lunch. And that's how he managed to work so hard. He became very comfortable. When he bought a house in Sandy Hill, it was actually 4 houses, and so he became a landlord. And of course, he'd never spend money to pay for somebody else to fix anything. So being a landlord meant that he was a landlord. He was an upholsterer, electrician, and a plumber. And he did all of those things. We lived in that house from when I was 9 till I was 15. And then by that time my father had done so well that we bought a very fancy house on the corner of Goulburn. This would be 265 Goulburn Avenue. Okay. I was one of 3 children. My brother was born in 1931. His name is Norman. And he went on to become an engineer. He was very bright and very studious and always very helpful to me, in math particularly. He graduated from Queens and he got a medal, so we were all very proud of him. I was born in 1932, and my sister was born in, let me see now, she would have been born about 1938, and her name is Rhoda. And we lived on 1127 Wellington Street until I was 9 years old. And that's when my father bought the church, and that's when we all moved to Sandy Hill. We went to Connaught Street School and Elmdale when we lived in the West End. And I took music lessons, what every Jewish girl had to take music lessons, even if they weren't talented. And I had to take tap dancing lessons. Never skating. Skating wasn't for Jewish girls. But not skiing. Those were frivolous. But playing the piano was serious stuff. And my brother went to Devonshire as well as Connaught and Elmdale. And but when we moved to Blackburn, I went to Osgood Street School, and my brother went to
York?
My brother went to York, and I went to Osgood Street School, and so did my sister. And my brother, as I said before, went on to Queens. And I went to Carleton University, and I wanted to become a social worker, but my father didn't believe in girls getting educated. And so I found that the only way I could do, after I got my BA at Carleton, the only way I could do postgraduate work was if I did it in Ottawa, and the only way I could do that was to go to a Roman Catholic school. So they had St. Patrick's School of Social Work, which was a school that graduated social workers for Roman Catholic agencies throughout North America. I was the first and only person I ever took that was not a Roman Catholic. But they were great to me, and I graduated. And my sister went on to, went to Carleton, and she was almost completed her degree in psychology. Learning was very important in our family. My mother always had a speller beside her as she did her vegetables, and she was always teaching herself to spell. She also read the classics. She read the classics, and when she was in New York, every payday she would buy one of the classics for 3 cents. And so I still have those beautiful leather-bound volumes of all the classic authors of the times. My mother, there wasn't any continuing education in those years, so when she wanted to learn, she went and sat with the grade 1 kids at the back of the class, and that's the way she learned her English and learned to write. She was a great reader, and she encouraged us in school. And although my father couldn't see the point of my getting educated, my mother was very much encouraged me to go ahead and get an education. Years later, though, my father said to me, "Look at all the years you've spent in social work. I'm very proud, and I was very foolish to discourage you. I never thought you'd use it, and I thought you'd get married and not use your education." So he said, but I've learned. So he did appreciate it. School activities. What did I do at school? School, there was a bunch of Jewish girls, and there was Zelda Akbar, Shirley Small, Zelda Soloway, Helen Alto, and Annie Clayman. And we all played together, and whether in public school it was marbles, that was the big deal. Marbles and skipping. And as we got older, we did everything together. Mostly what we did was talk about boys and talk on the phone, go sliding, and we'd walk to school every day. And as a matter of fact, the big deal was to go on a Sunday to Mickenberg's for a smoked meat sandwich. We'd walk all the way down, which would take us 3/4 of an hour, and then have a sandwich if we had the money, or just a drink if we didn't. And the other place was the Connaught Restaurant to have a milkshake. That was really living it up. We'd walk downtown and have a milkshake. But mostly there weren't too many activities as such. In school, we really tended to stay by ourselves because we were the Jewish kids. There was kind of a subtle anti-Semitism, never overt but covert, and you were always aware that you were different and you stuck to your own. And this was true in public school and even at Carleton. When I was at Carleton, you were certainly seen as, you were not an insider, you were an outsider. So there was a very strong tendency to stick to your own friends and your people of your own religion. The one thing, there were several wonderful things that happened in Ottawa. One was Habonim. Someone came from Montreal. So many good things came from Montreal in those days. And this man, talking about as I mentioned before, my brother went to Queen's and graduated in engineering. And after he graduated, he decided he wanted to work in the aeronautical. He was an aeronautical engineer, and he was a specialist in hydraulics. So he worked at Avro in Toronto. And when I was doing my post-grad work in social work, I did that in Toronto. And my brother used to take me out every Friday night for dinner, which was great. Introduced me to every man that he could think of, and took me out. So that was great. Great times. After I had met, let me see. I'm stopping just a minute. Okay. In order to go to university, since my father wasn't keen on a girl going to university, I always was employed. From the moment I was 15, I went to the Andrew Fleck daycare and asked them to employ me.
Where was that?
Andrew Fleck, the day nursery, is right on
King Edward.
King Edward, yeah, thanks. That's right, King Edward and Dalhousie. And, okay, no, it was on King Edward and George, right on the corner. And I was 15 at the time, and I remember I went there, asked them if I could work, and they said, "How old are you?" I said, "I was 15. They said they didn't employ anybody unless they were 16, I said I would work free. So they said, we'll employ you. So they paid me $12 a week, and I always thought I wanted to work with children. And I worked there for 3 summers. I worked there when I was 15, 16, 17, and 18. And I eventually got paid $20 a week, which was a lot of money.
How many hours?
I worked every day from 8 to 4 until the children left. It was shift. We all took turns. And I was still thinking that I wanted to do something with children, but I wasn't quite sure what. When I was 19, I had always wanted to go to camp. But because we had a summer cottage, my father thought it was frivolous to go to camp. Okay. The summer cottage was just in near Woodruff and along the Ottawa River, and it was the expensive side was on the water, and the cheaper cottages were across the street.
Okay.
The cottage that we lived in was right beside the railway tracks. It was in New Orchard Beach, and we were in the cheap side. And as the trains went by, the whole cottage rattled. And my father was an inventor, and he was very always inventing things, and he didn't want my mother to work hard. He was always very protective of her. So he engineered a way of pumping water with a motor so that she would just have to turn on a switch and the water would be pumped. It was quite an interesting mechanism. You had to look out the window to see when the pail was full because the water came out of this hose that you wash for. It was one of those wonderful, wild...
Rube Goldberg contraption.
Yes, exactly. And the floor was slanted, but we all enjoyed the cottage. And once we went out there, it was too far to go in during the summer. We stayed out there for the whole summer. And if we did go into town, it was a big event. And then we went in by streetcar. New Orchard Beach in those days was on way outside the outer limits of the city. This was in the country, and we considered it was a half an hour to come into the city by streetcar, and we considered that too long to come in regularly during the summer. So we were out there for the whole summer. Okay?
Yep, good.
So my father didn't believe in camps because we had this cottage, and I always yearned to go to camp. So when I was 19, I applied as a counselor at a very fancy camp in the Laurentians, and I became, because of my experience in daycare, they took me on, and I enjoyed that. That was wonderful. And then when I was 20, I still needed work, and Joe Feller had said to me, if you ever need a job, come and see me. He didn't know that I would come, but I did. And to his credit, he was a wonderful gentleman who took me on as a cashier, and I sold ties and was his cashier for several summers in a row, and that helped me get through university. The other stores that come to mind are, of course, Freeman's, which was the pearl. Everybody wanted to buy the latest fashions from Freeman's. They had an oval room, which was very fancy. I could only afford to buy something there if it was on sale, and I met all the other Jewish people at the sales. We were all trying to get the latest fashions from the oval room. I also worked on Saturdays at Freeman's, and I also worked at La Roque's on Saturdays at various periods during the time I was going to school. Let's see what else. My brother was a big influence on me because he was so studious and single-minded. He always knew he wanted to be an engineer. And he was very protective of me and always helped me get through all my math assignments, which were so difficult. The Jewish Community Center, I guess, came into being in the 50s. And though I was never really, by that time I was at university, and so I was never really a part of the activities at the Jewish Community Center. I remember the Habonim leaders who came from Montreal, and they were around, but only for a short period of time. They were delicious when they were here, but they didn't stay long. And most of the time, most of that period of time of growing up was spent in a very small group of people, young Jewish boys and girls that we socialized with, went to the Asiatic dances, went tobogganing, did those kinds of things. And
did any of the boys have cars? Tape, and Sheila is going to start talking about her married life.
World War II?
No, that'll come afterwards.
Okay. Well, I got married in 1955. I had met Morton about a year before, and he followed me to Toronto when I was taking my postgrad in social work, and he was very keen to get married. We got married in 1955, and I did not want to have children right away because I had just got my degree in social work.
Okay, he followed you and followed you.
I didn't really want to get married because I had just got my degree. So I said that I didn't want to have children right away because I had worked too hard for my degree and wanted to work in the field. But we got married, and I did work, as I had said to Maud, I wanted to work for at least 5 years before having children, which we did. Well, at least I did. And then we had 3 boys all in a row, and it was have one, when can I have the next one? Have one, have the next one, and so on. I originally thought I'd have 4, but 3 did me in. And the first one is David, born 1960, David Joshua. And the second one was Lawrence Finn, born 1961. And the third one was Coleman Jeremy, born 1963. And Morton was an artist. He had his own design firm, commercial art, and he designed books, did work for government, did work for Myers Motors, and so on. Did a lot of, did the labels for Pure Spring products, did LaPointe's, the design they still use over their store.
The logo.
The logo, yeah. So he was very busy, had a very busy career, and he came from a family, Morton's family. He had a sister, Irene, and his parents. His father was a talented musician. Before coming to Ottawa, he actually played the trumpet at Carnegie Hall, and his mother was a pianist. She was from Hamilton. His grandparents were from London, England. And when we married, we lived on Thessaly Circle. First we lived on Mark Avenue, which was the Jewish district for all young couples because the rent was cheap. It was $99 for a 2-bedroom apartment. So everybody went there when they first got married. And it was a nice place to be, as I worked at the Children's Aid Society, which was just a few blocks away, and I could walk to work to and from. After I worked at the Children's Aid for 5 years, working with children, and we bought a house after a few years on Thessaly Circle, and that was when we had our 3 sons. And then we moved to Palin Avenue, which was, the boys were then, Coleman was a year old, David was 4, and Lawrence was 3. And I went back to work when David was 7.
Do you remember the war years at all?
I do. Now, I was 7 years old during when the war started, and so I remember rationing and sugar being a delicacy. But I remember also that Zelda Akbar, and I wanted to do something for the war, and so we made a blanket of squares. At first we thought it was going to be for a soldier, but then we decided it was for a baby because we couldn't make any more. So,
or a small soldier.
So our heart was in the right place, even if we ran out of patience for these little squares. We donated the blanket to the Red Cross, and I don't know what they ever did with it. But by the time Morton spent the war years in Europe, actually. He signed up when he was 17. His parents only allowed him to go to sign up because they thought he wouldn't be accepted. But he was, and he and Abby Evanchik joined the Air Force together, and they had this big vision of being photographers and spending the summer at Abby's sumptuous cottage, which was nearby. Well, it didn't work out that way. Morton became a photographer, and Abby ended up in Newfoundland, and Morton ended up in Europe, and they never did get to go to the cottage. But Morton had a wonderful, I think for him, it was growing up. He said he remembers when the train left the station, he was very fearful and very frightened because it was the first time he was away from home.
And it's hard to remember that these were 17-year-old kids.
They were 17-year-old kids. Now, when I met Morton, he was 30. And I was about 21, 22 at the time. So by that time, he had established his business and was doing all kinds of very interesting work for government, whether it was a book on canoeing or a book. He did all kinds of things for, he for years did the magazine North. And so it was very interesting when I was at a cocktail party when I was about 35. My son David was 7, and somebody asked me to apply for a job at Northern Affairs. They wanted to hire a social worker to set up counseling services for the Inuit. And I applied for the job, and they asked me if I spoke French, and I said no. And they asked me if I had my master's, and I said no. And so I was sure I wasn't going to get the job. So then they asked me how I was going to take care of my children. Since I figured I wasn't going to get the job anyways, I just stood up and said, if I didn't think I could take care of my children, I wouldn't be here. Then I got the job, so I had to worry about how to take care of my children. And I hired a babysitter. And I was very fortunate that the federal government was experimenting with women working their hours. So I was to work 20 hours a week of my choosing and set up counseling services for the Inuit. It was a very exciting job because I traveled to Frobisher Bay, to Churchill, and I met Inuit people, artists, translators, designers, and I still see them, they still visit me. And one of them just designed the drummer on the back of the toonie and sent me one of those first coins. So that was a wonderful job that I really enjoyed and still enjoy today, meeting with Inuit people. From there, I went to, I don't know if you want to hear about my work.
Sure.
Okay. From there, I went to Children's Aid Society and worked as did reports for the court in regard to custody. So this would be doing assessments of parents prior to their custody.
Children's Aid here in Ottawa.
Yeah, here in Ottawa. Then I worked with unmarried mothers in St. Mary's Maternity Home and set up counseling services for, group services for unmarried mothers. And because I was very interested in doing group work, the Children's Aid sent me to McGill to take a course. And I met a professor there by the name of Larry Shulman, and he asked me to join the research team at McGill, which I did for a few years. So I worked one day a week in Montreal, went into McGill, and I was his man in Ottawa, setting up a research project that was trying to look at what are the, what make up the helping process. I worked with Larry for a couple of years. Then I was hired to, it was the year of the child, and it was 1976, and the Children's Aid was looking for someone to head up a project to set up research in the field of child abuse, to do a research project in testing out new ways of working with abusing families. I applied for the job and got it, and we worked at that project for 4 years, and it was very successful, and we put out a book, and until, I guess, I was asked to write an executive summary of that particular project several years later, which I did. But after that, I worked as a conciliator at family court for a year, which was a dreadful job. Lawyers hated to sit in front of social workers. And I was so glad to have that year finished.
Conciliator, same as a mediator? Same idea?
Yeah. It was what you did as a conciliator was you tried to find issues that the couple agreed upon. It might be issues of custody, issues of visiting. The usual contentious issue was one of money. So you tried to get as many issues as you could sorted out before they went before the judge. Tried to find agreement. And after a year there, which was all I could take, I then got a job as a medical social worker at the Civic Hospital, and I stayed there until retirement. And that was a wonderful job because the doctors really valued the social workers' input, and I had a lot of freedom to set up services in several different departments.
And is that where you became interested in geriatrics?
Yep. I certainly I was working a lot with a geriatric population. I worked with the vascular team, and also I set up social work services in the pre-admit unit. So this is where I would see a lot of, certainly geriatric, the geriatric population. Oh, having kids was wonderful. They were delicious and a torment at the same time, but mostly delicious. And the children were very competitive, and they played hockey, and they had musical instruments. two of them, David played the guitar, so did Lawrence, and Coleman was a drummer. It's interesting that Coleman has gone on to be in a Japanese drumming group, and now he's in a Brazilian drumming group, which has just put out a CD. The boys were lively and demanding, and all the things kids are. David went and got a degree in environmental science at Trent. Lawrence got a master's in industrial relations at Queen's. And Coleman went and got a degree in radio and television at Ryerson. And David is presently married with one child, Noah, who's 4 years old and who we just visited this weekend. And David is a manager at a ski resort in Burlington, Vermont. So we had a wonderful skiing weekend. Lawrence is in sport marketing. He has his own business, and he and his wife, Hélène, joined us at the ski resort this past weekend. We all skied together, which was wonderful. Coleman is in Toronto. He is a manager at the largest commercial film company in Canada. It's called Partners, and he manages several different departments. He would have joined us this past weekend, but he had several gigs with his Brazilian group. And it's wonderful when they all come together. Lawrence has a cottage, and so that we managed to get together at least for Rosh Hashanah, Pesach, and during the summer. So those are the times that are very special. But one thing that I didn't mention was that because my husband was an artist, besides being a designer, my husband was teaching at the Ottawa School of Art, and he was also loved to paint. He started the Ottawa Watercolor Society. So we, as the kids were growing up, every summer we would go away for at least a month. First time when the kids were 4, 3, and 1, we rented a cottage in Nova Scotia, and Morton painted there. And then we rented a cottage in Newfoundland another summer. And we traveled across the west, and Morton painted in the west, and he painted in PEI. He painted in the Yukon. We had a wonderful trip where we traveled all the way up to the Yukon with our sons, and we camped all the way. And all of these trips were with a camping in a trailer, a very small trailer. But the kids loved it. They would spend the summers traveling with Morton and I as Morton painted, and for a month, and then the other month would be spent at summer camp. And they remember those occasions with great delight. Is the time what?
Okay.
Okay. When Morton was painting on location, the kids sometimes painted with him, but often they just went, say for example in the Yukon, we would go off on hikes and we would go fishing and we would do all kinds of things. And Morton in the Yukon was delighted because there were 20 hours of sunlight. So he was happy to paint for 20 hours. And we parked along the Klondike and the Yukon River, and the kids would, we did some different water sports, and they painted. As a matter of fact, Coleman sold a painting up in the Yukon. The croupier lady bought it. It was her car that he painted. And so that the kids knew that when we went on a painting trip, that they could paint with their father if they wanted to, but they also could just hike and do the regular things. For example, when we were in BC, we went to Jasper and went up and did the hike all the way up to the tea house. But now what Morton is still painting, and he teaches three times a week, and he tries to paint a couple days a week in between. When he's on location, he paints every day. At home, there's more things that demand his attention and time. But the kids, what's interesting is because these boys are, their father's an artist, they all think that they're good artists, and that's a big help. Okay. All right. I wanted to talk just a little bit about the fact that when I retired, one of my ambitions was to do a bat mitzvah. It wasn't important that girls learn Hebrew and go to Hebrew school when I was growing up, and it was something I always wanted to do. So last year, on my son David's anniversary bar mitzvah date, I did my bat mitzvah, and that was thrilling. I really enjoyed studying and completing that part. I also wove my talit, and I'm continuing to be involved in a lot of Jewish studies. I took the Jewish history course from Eugene Rothman at university after I retired, and I'm continuing to study Hebrew and just getting very involved in the synagogue. It's Temple Israel that I belong to now, and I find it's wonderful because women are expected to do the same as men, and I find that a challenge and a treat. In regard to Morton, Morton doesn't plan to retire. He plans to keep on painting, and I plan to keep on studying. I had a skating lesson this morning and skiing lessons, and he and I are taking Tai Chi, and so it goes.
This just about finishes the taping. It's been very, very enjoyable. I think I took you down the garden path. It's an hour reel, but actually you're getting close to 2 hours when you're sitting around and schmoozing and reminiscing and remembering things. And time goes fast when you're having fun. Thank you again.